Yaden here. We're just going to do a quick video on the historical backgrounds of the New Testament. Just a reminder, this will be this video and then there'll be one more, all of which would need to be watched and then responded to by Friday, March 27th at 11:59 p.m. Okay, and then make sure your readings and stuff are done there. And hopefully you all can get that done, have plenty of time to go for it. I'll have this one out today and then hopefully the next one out tomorrow or Wednesday, and it'll all be ready for you to go. But let's get into this historical situation. The first thing to remember about when reading the New Testament is that Jesus, Paul, Peter, the different people in the New Testament, especially the authors, were almost all Jewish people, right? They lived during specifically the Second Temple period. Now, we've already talked about that, so hopefully you know a little bit about that. We'll pick back up on some of those things later. But you have to know that they had been taken over again by the Romans, right? If you remember back, there was the Babylonians, then there was the Persians, then there was the Hellenists, the Seleucids, those kind of people. They got their freedom for about 100 years during the Maccabean period, and then Rome came back and took Jerusalem, took the Judea back over. So at this point, they're back under the oppression, under the heel, you might say, under the rule of another country, of another king, especially. That's very important for them when they want a King David. They want a king from the line of David. And so this is where they're at, right, under Roman occupation. Now, Roman occupation, a few things about that. The Romans were pretty open about the way things were ran in their provinces. For instance, they didn't try to switch the culture a whole lot. They said, hey, look, as long as you don't cause a lot of trouble, as long as you maybe accept a few of our gods and you play by our rules for the most part, we're going to leave you be. So what they would do is the Senate would vote, and they would send what they would call a governor. We'll call him a governor now. There's a different, more difficult name for that, but governor will work. I think that's the way a lot of translations will take it. They would send someone. They would be the governor over that area. Now, that governor sometimes would just call himself a king, right? So we have King Herod, for instance, in the Gospels. And all they had to do was keep the people calm and pay taxes back to Rome, and the Romans would pretty much leave them alone, right? They could do the religious stuff as they wanted. They could live life the way they wanted. And that's the way we have it when Jesus was born, right around that area. They had the king, who was actually a puppet of the Roman Empire, but he had more or less was able to do what he wanted until they came for him. So that's what's going on there. There's also at this point a large gap between the rich and the poor. The leaders, the Romans, they didn't really care a whole lot about keeping equality, keep making sure everyone was doing well. As long as the Roman Empire was doing well, they had the Pax Romana, they just didn't care a whole lot. So a lot of this time, there's just a great division of rich and poor. The rich people really, especially in Judea, really sucked up to Rome. Rome gave them back some good stuff, gave them back political power, money, all of that stuff. Meanwhile, there was also the poor Palestinians, the tenant farmers, who just didn't have a lot. And you're going to see that Jesus ends up spending more time with these sort of poor Palestinians than he does these rich people, even though the richer people come back in. Now, the Jewish people were also looked at from the Roman perspective as inferior. They were marked out by a darker skin color, and just seen as kind of dumb and backwards, right? Their religion seemed kind of silly, where the Roman Empire was cosmopolitan and they kind of ruled the roost and they were the leaders of the known world. They kind of looked at the Jewish people. They were a weird sect. They looked different than them. They didn't really follow by the same rules, so they just kind of looked down upon them for various reasons, right? You see later in, I think it's in Acts, where they say they're ignorant. They're from that area, so they must be ignorant, right? So that's kind of a few things about where they are in the bigger world picture. Now, as far as the religious situation, there's a few different reactions from the Jewish people towards Roman occupation. There was the Herodians. We only see them 2 or 3 times in the Gospels. They were pretty happy with King Herod, with his dynasty, and they really sucked up, really liked that. So they were really big. As far as we know, there's a little stuff on that, but a little question on that. But as far as we know, they really liked Herod, and they called themselves Herodians. Next down is what we call the Sadducees. Now, if you've read the Gospels, you know about the Sadducees. When I was a kid, we sang a song. They were sad, you see. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's what we sang. But the Sadducees were a group of mostly priests, so religious elites, right? And these religious elites, they were kind of doing well with Rome. And so they were okay with a little bit of adoption of Roman practice, right, of Roman life, or Hellenization, sort of Greek life, right? they were okay with taking sort of the ways of the empire and adopting them to the Jewish um, way of life. They were okay with the connections there. They were okay with Rome ruling them. Again, they were in power, so they didn't care a whole lot and all that stuff. But there were religious elites who were okay with that. They only believed that the Torah, the first 5 books, were the Word of God, and they did not believe in the afterlife. They believed there was no afterlife, right? So you see them trying to trick Jesus into that for some things. On the other side, there are the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are common people. None of them are priests or anything like that. They're not religious leaders necessarily, but they are very religious. These are the people that, if you ever heard the 613 laws, they developed those. They have these 613 laws that they really followed to a T and tried to work through those. Now, they were not super happy about Roman occupation, but they didn't really see any way around it. So what they did was they resisted Roman rule and then the Greek influence, the Hellenization, by a strict focus on Torah observance. Right? They said, we're going to do what we're supposed to do. We're going to follow this, and hopefully God will work this out. But that's the way we're going to resist Roman rule. So the Pharisees, Sadducees are a little more okay. Pharisees a little not as much, right? They're not quite as elite, so they're like, hey, this isn't that great. So there's the Pharisees. The Pharisees are also going to be the people later that kind of dictate how Judaism goes forward. The Sadducees kind of fall away, and the Pharisees almost, what we might say, helped construct the next era of Judaism after Jesus' time. So that's another reason why we see them as kind of bad guys in here, because the writers are writing against a lot of them. They're arguing with them while they're writing the Gospels. They also see Pharisees, and they're saying, hey, these Pharisees are jerks. We're going to write them as pretty bad guys in the Gospels. Okay? Pharisees. Another couple, 2 groups. First, the Essenes. We don't see them in the Bible, but they factor pretty big in the historical situation of this time. The Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're familiar with that, come from a group of Essenes. These were people that completely separated themselves from society. They had a strict following of Torah. They followed the law really strictly. They had these communal groups, right, that they lived. They shared everything together. They pulled away from the world. And they did that because they thought that the world was so broken, so bad, that this was the only way forward. And so they sat there, they followed the Torah, they shared everything. They had these small religious groups, these very strict religious groups, sitting there waiting for God to intervene. They were apocalyptic, if you remember that term. They believed that God eventually was going to come and destroy everything, and then God would say, hey, you guys have been following Torah, so come with me. I'm not going to destroy you. And so they kind of had their own little way out in the wilderness. A lot of scholars believe John the Baptist was an Essene. If you listen to some of his language, it sounds similar to them. We're not sure about that, but if you want to kind of a picture of an Essene, right, kind of a weird, odd people who are out in the wilderness who are saying weird things, John the Baptist, right? So Essenes, and then lastly, the Zealots. The Zealots were fiercely loyal to Jewish tradition and hated Roman rule, right? They would not pay taxes. They refused to pay taxes, which got them in a lot of trouble. And they wanted armed rebellion. They thought that God would come down, help them to defeat the Romans, right? Just like the Maccabees did. So these are guys, mostly guys, again, this is a patriarchal society, so they're the ones making their choices and having these different groups. They say, we're going to take down Rome. God will be on our side. We will fight, and God will take them down. So Zealots. I'll put these all on your papers just so you see the different ways that they've reacted to Roman rule. I'm going to take a moment real fast just to see if how these videos are going, if people are able to get through them. If you send me an email right when you're done with this lecture and tell me what color shirt I'm wearing and what animal's on it, right? There's a little animal right there. I think you can see that. Just tell me that just so I know if this is just to help me know if people are watching these, if these are actually being helpful, or if I'm just making them and no one's watching, right? If you send me that, I'll give you 10 bonus points on your exam. And that'll let me know first that you're watching and that you're doing your work. And secondly, if no one's watching this, then I don't have to make this much longer. But anyway, I didn't want to make a big deal of that. Just want to stop for a second. If you're watching this, send me that email after you're done, okay? I know it's kind of goofy, but I felt it was the easiest way for me to get this done. So, last few things. One more group of people that we're going to talk about that aren't necessarily a political group, but do factor in. And this is the Samaritans. From best we know, the Samaritans are probably descendants of Jewish people who intermarried with Assyrians and other groups after Israel and Judah fell. So they kind of were mixed in with them. They had intermarried. Remember, we talked about how in the Second Temple period, they were very big on not intermarrying with other groups. These were groups that had, right? Whether they were forced to, whether they did it by choice, we don't know. But they're intermarried with that. Because of that, they'd been kicked out of the Jewish temple. They weren't allowed there. And they had created their own temple, their own form of worship, and even their own Torah elsewhere. So the Jews really didn't like them, right? Really hated them. They were close to Judaism, but just not. And sometimes those people who are really close to you, right, the people right to your left or your right, those are the people you really hate because they're so close to you, but so far away. So they really hate these people. You're going to see this come out in the New Testament, especially with Jesus talking about this. These guys, the Samaritans, were considered the worst of the worst. Now, we can talk about one major event and then we'll be done. In around 70, a little before 70 AD, there was a major Jewish uprising, right? Jews got together and decided, we are coming back. God is going to be on our side, and he will release us from Roman rule. So they started to fight back against Rome and say, we're going to get our freedom. Rome, as being the superpower of the day they were, they ended up marching on Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in this Jewish rebellion. They destroyed the temple, and at this point, the future of Judaism is up in the air. And so since it's up in the air, since things are tense, the Pharisees and now we'll say Christ followers, the Christians, these early Christians, are vying for what will be the future of Judaism, right? What will be the future? And so they become sort of mortal enemies, fighting about what will be next. So you have Pharisees on one side, Christians on the other. And you're going to see this because these Pharisees come out as bad guys in the Gospels. There's a reason why they put them there. Okay? And so at that point, so your Gospels, Mark's written right about there. Now, a lot of your New Testament is written after this. Okay? It's written after the fall of the temple. A lot of Paul's letters are before, but most of the rest of the New Testament is afterwards. And you're going to see a difference in language between those if you pay attention to them, right? Paul is writing to communities where there's Jew and Gentile worshiping together. It's a little different after that. So that's a major point. 70 AD, the temple fell. So Christianity was seen up until 70 AD mostly as just an apocalyptic sect within Judaism. It wasn't until after 70 AD that they were kind of seen in their own merits, seen as their own thing. Okay? So a few things that I'm going to be putting on your final exam. I'm working out how that's going to work. You need to know what these groups are. At least you need to know what Sadducees, Pharisees, and Zealots are. Those are 3 important groups that you need to know, and Samaritans. So 4 groups, we'll say that. Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Samaritans. You'll need to know what those are for your final. And then you need to know 70 AD, what happens there. Okay, the temple falls in 70 AD, and there's a division between the two. Okay, guys, thank you all. Thank you for all your good work. The questions that have been posted so far are really good. I'm just figuring out how we go, since we're going to be doing this for the rest of the class, I'm going to see how this works and be reevaluating things for how we finish this class. Guys, have a good night, and I'll talk to you later.